I'm Lee Wright. Thank you for your patience. We took just a couple of minutes to finalize technical details. This is the first History Camp online session, and we're delighted you're with us. I'm, like I said, Lee Wright. I founded History Camp and am the president of the Pursuit of History. I am near Boston, and with me in Virginia.
I'm Carrie Lund, and I started History Camp Colorado, and I am the executive director for the Pursuit of History.
So, History Camp Boston is going to be July 11th. We are confident, also crossing our fingers, and we wanted to start to bring some of that great content online to people, both who have been missing it. We originally scheduled History Camp Boston for March, as well as to folks who aren't able to attend. And we thought that the best possible first speaker would be John Bell, incredibly fitting because he was the first person to say yes and join us and make History Camp Boston happen some 6 or so years ago. John is the author of the book, The Road to Concord, and this is going to be one of our topics tonight. John, welcome.
Thank you. Hello.
And, I've been reading Boston 1775, your extraordinarily well-researched blog for quite some time. Why don't you give folks a little sense of when you start, kind of what stimulated your interest in Boston history and how you chose the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the Road to Concord, as the topic for your first book?
Okay, well, I grew up here in the Boston area, and I grew up during the bicentennial. So I had this double, triple dose of Revolutionary War history, the beginning of the war, the Tea Party, the massacre, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, Battle of Bunker Hill. I thought it was very interesting. I really enjoyed David Hackett Fisher's book, Paul Revere's Ride. I enjoyed visiting the historic sites, but I thought that story had been told so much that there wasn't really much more to learn. And then in about 1998, when I was transitioning from one career to another, I read this little biography of Samuel Adams. And it mentioned an event which I had not remembered if I had ever read about it before, which was the death of Christopher Sider, an 11-year-old boy, in a political demonstration 11 days before the Boston Massacre. And Christopher Sider is really the first person in Boston to die out of the political dispute that ultimately led to the revolution. And I thought, there's more to research here. There is a story that hasn't been told, at least not to me. At least it didn't penetrate. So why don't I keep researching? At that same event, when Christopher Sider was killed, was mortally wounded with bullets in his chest, another boy, 19 years old, was hit in the hand and thigh. And he survived. He had a long life, long career. His name was Samuel Gore. And as I went and researched him, I discovered this other story, which hadn't appeared in history books for many decades, but was part of the standard story of Boston and the Revolution in the late 1800s. And that has to do with stolen cannon. And I thought, well, that's interesting because it wasn't part of anything that I had heard and read and seen when I went to the historic sites. And then I was able to put the story of the cannon being stolen from Boston together with the story of cannon being searched for in Concord by General Gage and his troops. And that provided a new version, a new angle on the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and that's what the Road to Concord is all about.
Well, John, one of the things that we did when we kind of did a short announcement, you and I and Carrie did a short announcement about this a week ago, is we invited people to pose questions. And one of those questions, and perhaps the right place for us to start as we talk about this in a little more detail, is whose cannon were they?
The 4 stolen cannon belonged to a militia company in Boston called the Train. It was the artillery company. So these were men who chose to do their militia service, not wandering around, not marching around with firelocks or muskets, but training to work together to fire these 4 cannon. So if there was ever a battle, if ever the French invaded or something like that, they would be able to defend the country using cannon, using artillery. The cannon that they had, they were very proud of it because they were brass cannon, very shiny, rather advanced. Two of them had been ordered in 1768, so they thought they were new. They might even have been new, and so they had like war games on the common during the years leading up to the Revolutionary War, where half the train would go and pretend to be the French, and half would pretend to be the heroic British and fight them off and wheel these cannon around and fire off shots without any cannonball. And this was a great source of pride to Boston. So when the four cannon were in armories inside Boston, this was seen as part of Bostonians' self-defense, and they were very proud. Boston had other cannon at the shore batteries overlooking the harbor, and other neighboring seaport towns also had batteries. And so most or all of those cannon were old. They were iron cannon. They had been left over from the previous war. They were often heavier, bigger than the brass cannon in Boston, which were really, by cannon standards, dinky. They were called 2-pounders and 3-pounders because they shot cannonballs that were 2 pounds and 3 pounds in weight, and that meant that they were about 4 feet long rather than 8 feet long and able to throw 24 pounds or 32 pounds of lead at somebody.
Well, so let's bring the story up kind of closer to Patriots Day, and of course, one of the other reasons why we've wanted to kind of kick this off now and are so happy that you could be with us, John, is because we are coming up to Patriots Day, social distancing and all that. So why don't you take us through kind of what led to men deciding that if they were going to use those cannon, they better get them out of Boston, and how they go about doing it. Certainly, one of the things that I think people are surprised to learn about is Boston then is very different geographically than Boston today. So perhaps talk about some of the challenges of getting those cannon out of Boston in that time.
Okay, well, I'll go start with the geography. The British or the English, when they settled in Massachusetts, they chose to settle on Boston and Charlestown and some other places because they were easily defended from the land. Boston was a peninsula, like a tadpole with just its tail touching the rest of Massachusetts. So there's just one road out of Boston, which made it very easy to defend from the land side. And as Boston grew, as the settlement grew, that became less and less of a convenience. It was actually rather inconvenient to try to get into Boston because you had to go and get on that one road or on the Charlestown Ferry. But then when the political situation in Massachusetts heated up in 1774, suddenly that geography took a new meaning. Now, what happened in 1774 is, first, there was the Boston Tea Party at the end of 1773. Parliament learned about that. They didn't like it. They started to pass what were called the coercive acts to try to make Boston apologize, recompense the East India Company for those thousands of pounds worth of tea that had been destroyed, to be more obedient to the royal authorities. So among the laws that were passed at that time by Parliament was something called the Massachusetts Government Act, which changed the constitution of Massachusetts unilaterally, making it much more of a top-down government. Well, the people of Massachusetts were already seeing troops in Boston. They were already seeing the Royal Navy and the Customs Office closing the port of Boston. So they were primed to see this new law as oppressive. And then in early September 1774, the new governor, the royal governor, who was also the general in charge of all the British troops in North America, Thomas Gage, he ordered some of his men to go to Charlestown and Cambridge and confiscate the gunpowder and 2 cannon that belonged to the Cambridge militia, or the Middlesex County militia, and bring them all into the army camp inside Boston so that he felt more secure, so that he felt that that weaponry could not be stolen and used against the king's troops. Well, naturally, the people of Middlesex County saw that as an attempt to remove their property and their right to self-defense. And what resulted on September 2nd, 1774, has become known as the Powder Alarm, where a militia uprising took place in waves, moving out from Cambridge through the whole province, into Connecticut, into Rhode Island. The news went down to Philadelphia, where the First Continental Congress was meeting. And that was what shifted people's thinking about the conflict in Massachusetts. No longer were they thinking we can resolve this through political means, through protests, through conventions. This had become a military conflict, and suddenly military weapons were very important. And people in Boston looked around and they said, well, we've got these cannon at the shore batteries. Can we get some of those? Well, they couldn't, because the British military was in Boston. The Navy was on the harbor. The Army was actually had taken over one of the two batteries. But in Charlestown, they started to move the cannon out in the early September. In Dorchester, they started to move what was called the Great Gun away from a point over the Neponset River. So the people spontaneously, the people of their towns began to take these weapons and take control of them to make sure that they could not be taken away from them by the British military, as it happened in Cambridge on the 1st. The trains for weapons were a very special case because, as I said, the train was very proud of these. The Boston itself was very proud of these. They really wanted to keep control of these. They were in two armories, or gun houses as they were called, which were small buildings, maybe the size of a two-car garage, in the middle of town. One of those gun houses was directly facing onto the Boston Common. Now, on Boston Common at this time was the King's Own Regiment, and possibly other British Army regiments. So there were hundreds, possibly more than 1,000 troops in tents on that greensward, with a clear view of the front door of the gun house. The other gun house was a little bit farther away, but as soon as General Gage realized that these cannon were going to be significant, he ordered redcoat soldiers to be sentries in front of each gun house. Nevertheless, on a rather rainy night in the middle of September, at the end of that night, the soldiers discovered that a hole had been broken into the wall of the old gun house, and the two guns inside, the two cannon, were missing. So General Gage immediately ordered more redcoats guarding the gun house next to the common. As I said, it was very close to the camp, so it looked pretty hard to get into. It was also, there was a back door to this building, but the back door was barred on the inside, and then it opened into a yard which had a high fence around it, so it was hard to get into the yard. And the only other way to get into that yard was through one of the town schools, where you had upwards of 200 boys 6 days a week. And how could you do that without being noticed? And yet, when General Gage sent his men to that gun house in order to take the cannon away and move them into the common so they would be absolutely certain of not being stolen, they opened the door and the guns were gone.
So John, any idea who did that?
Well, I mentioned earlier the name of Samuel Gore. He was, in the 1820s, he was a very successful businessman. He went bankrupt late in the 1820s, but in the early 1820s, he was a very successful businessman. He was the older brother of a man who had been governor of Massachusetts. He was really very respected. And he told this story about how the men of the train of this militia company in early September decided that they needed to take control of their weapons. And so he told the story of how they snuck through that school into the fenced yard, and the high fence, which had previously been an obstacle to them, turned out to be a benefit because it hid them from all the soldiers on the common. Then they were able to knock up the bar on the back door of the gun house by sticking a stick through the little crack in the doorway, and then carried the guns out. These guns are a few £100 a piece. And instead of trying to get them away, they went back into the schoolhouse and they hid them inside the schoolhouse. And they stayed there, in fact, for a couple of weeks, Samuel Gore said, until the coast was clear, until the British had stopped looking for them around there. And then they were taken out to a blacksmith's forge, and then later they were put in a boat, probably, and moved over. Or the other possibility is a manure wagon. There's a lot of manure in these stories of smuggling cannon. The moved out to Roxbury, and then to a tavern in Dorchester. And there, when they were in Dorchester, suddenly the Patriots learned that General Gage was tracking these guns, and he had some sort of spy within their network. They were trying to figure out who. And they decided, Dr. Joseph Warren decided, he wrote a letter to Samuel Adams that survives in the New York Public Library saying, we have to be very careful. This blacksmith is going to change sides. We're going to move the cannon away from Dorchester out to Concord. And that's how all four brass guns from Boston eventually ended up out in Concord, where the Patriots were starting to assemble the weapons for their army.
So, John, I want to take this to the near present day for just a minute. Those cannons ended up, or at least one of them ended up in a quite surprising place. And I believe you're the person who is responsible for it ultimately getting in a place that made a lot more sense. So do you want to tell a little story about your discovery and kind of what happened?
Sure. There were four cannon, as I said, four brass cannon from Boston, and we can trace them through the very beginning of the war when they became part of the Continental Army's armaments. And then then I lose track of them. I can't trace them anymore, but sometime during the war, the Continental Army loses two of them to the British. But they end the war with two. They are in the hands of the federal government, and the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, gets a letter from Governor of Massachusetts, John Hancock, asking, hey, can we have our property back? Because after all, the whole Revolutionary War was about preserving property. And so General Knox sent back the two cannon, but when he did so, he also had them engraved with the names of Hancock and Adams, and a little story about their history, an exaggerated story, but from then on, it is impossible to miss which cannon we're talking about, because they are unique. They have this engraving, they have their names. In the 1840s, when the Bunker Hill Monument was completed, they were put in the chamber at the top. So you went all up those 290 plus stairs, and from the top you got a great view of Boston and a view of these two brass cannon that were standing there, or attached to the wall. As the story of these cannons sort of fell out of favor and fell out of the history books in the 20th century, these cannon up in the chamber seemed less and less important. Nobody quite understood what their significance was. Then, as I understand it, at some point in the 1970s, one was removed. The Hancock was taken away. I've heard different stories about how it was taken away, whether it was officially taken down because it was getting loose and the National Park Service was, or the Massachusetts District Commission at the time, the MDC, was worried that it might fall over and hurt somebody or get damaged. But there's also a legend that it was thrown out one of the windows, which is much more picturesque. But in any case, one of these cannon was taken away. The other one, the Adams, stayed up there. Years passed, still nothing happened. And then sometime in the 1980s, the MDC police was clearing out one of its basements, clearing off a whole bunch of stolen bicycles. And at the bottom of this pile of bicycles was a brass cannon. And they didn't know what to do with this, so they gave it to the National Park Service, which had by that point taken over the Bunker Hill Monument. And I think they realized, because it was a unique cannon, because there was nothing else that had this engraving on it, they knew that it should go to the Park Service, to the Bunker Hill Monument. it was then kept in what the NPS called preservation storage for many years, which was in reality a large warehouse in the Charlestown Navy Yard. And that was where I got wind of it, and I went and looked at it and studied it. And I studied it with a tape measure, looking at it alongside a set of measurements in a notebook from the Massachusetts Historical Society, which was kept by a man named David Mason, the man who had founded the militia train, the man who his descendants said had helped to collect cannon for the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. And inside that notebook, there was a set of measurements of 2 brass cannon that exactly matched what the Hancock was. 46 inches long, this width, this amount of distance from the screw hole, and so on. So, and that was an unorthodox, that was not regular measurement. So that was definitely the cannon that David Mason was measuring in 1774 and 1775. And it had gone all the way through the war to Philadelphia, back to Boston, up into the Bunker Hill Monument, down to the basement of the MDC, over to the National Park Service, and then at that point, we realized what it was. I was at that point already doing this research, so the NPS and I talked, and they realized what a significant find this was, and they decided to conserve it. The Hancock is now been cleaned and restored and is on display out at the Concord Visitor Center of Minuteman National Historical Park. They also decided to take the Adams cannon, which was still up in the chamber at the top of the Bunker Hill Monument and thus exposed to the elements because that's an open chamber. They decided to take that down, conserve it, clean out the gunk that had accumulated inside, and that is on display now at the bottom of the Bunker Hill Monument in the little lodge there. So both of these cannon are now recognized their significance in the war, and they are both being very carefully tended to and displayed for visitors. And when the parks reopen, I urge people to go and look at those cannon.
John, that's got to be immensely satisfying to go to those sites and see those and think that if it wouldn't have been for your research and being so aware of this and so forth, they'd be under a pile of bicycles or largely ignored as people looked out the windows at the top of the Bunker Hill Monument.
Yeah.
Your story is a great example of the tremendous original research that you do, and that's one of the reasons that I find Boston 1775, your daily posts, so interesting. One of the other things that makes them especially interesting is the work you've done to ascertain whether or not some widely held views, much beloved historical facts are indeed facts, whether or not those things actually happened or whether or not that's just the way we've come to know them. Now, in your research for your book, are there some things that you came across that you think would surprise people, even folks who think they know the history of that day?
Well, one of the things which is still said about the Battle of Lexington and Concord is that the British Army came out to Lexington to try to arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams. And this was a great fear of the Patriots of Massachusetts. They were very pleased that Hancock and Adams got away. The reason Henry Knox named these cannon after Hancock and Adams was because they had been so, this pair of men had been just very, very important at the beginning of the war. However, when I went to the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where the Clements Library holds General Thomas Gage's papers, and I went through those papers, there is no suggestion that he is interested in finding Hancock and Adams. He's not tracking them. He doesn't have informants telling him where they are. He doesn't put in his detailed orders for the march out to Concord or the second draft anything about finding Hancock and Adams. When the British Army arrives in Lexington, they don't go to what is currently the Hancock-Clark parsonage, where Hancock and Adams had been up until a few hours before. So there's really no sign that the British were actually interested in Hancock and Adams. There's just a great fear by the Americans, by the New Englanders, that that would be the object of the march. What General Gage was interested in, well, it was right at the top of his first draft of orders when he sent Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith out to Concord. It is 4 brass cannon. It is the 4 cannon that were stolen from Boston. That was one of the top of his shopping list.
And just to clarify, they never captured all 4 of them. Is that correct?
It's very hard to say what happened to them during the war. When they were sent back to Boston after the war, there was a notice in the newspaper saying that there was a very interesting history of them during the war. They had been captured and recaptured, and these are the 2 left. And in our next issue, we'll tell you all about it. And the next issue doesn't say a thing.
Well, John, other stories that you came across, or other facts and you came across in your research that shed light on some of the things that we've heard about, think we know, maybe the what actually happened is somewhat at variance with what we think we know.
Well, one of the things that David Hackett Fisher's book, Paul Revere's Ride, resurrected this story and made it popular, although he didn't say it definitely happened. He certainly hinted that it might have, and it's a very entertaining story, that the last informant that Dr. Joseph Warren consulted before sending Paul Revere and William Dawes out to Lexington and beyond to warn Hancock and Adams was none other than General Thomas Gage's wife, Margaret Gage. And of course, there's all this. It's a sexy story. It's a secret. There's irony. It's a great story. The problem is the evidence for it is very, very weak. I think that book, Paul Revere's Ride, overstates some of the evidence. It takes an informer who was speaking to Samuel Adams a few days before and makes that person Dr. Joseph Warren's informant. But the most important evidence, I think, is that the argument in the book is that the Gages became estranged because of this, and their relationship was never the same again. And General Gage sent his wife home early from Boston. He sent her home early when she was pregnant, and he was in a besieged town. So frankly, if my spouse were to send me away from a besieged town, I would be grateful. And then when they got back to Britain, rather than be estranged, they had another child together. So the evidence that there was an estrangement, the evidence is just, I think, quite weak. But for a while, this very dramatic story was part of the telling in Boston of how the Battle of Lexington and Concord came down.
So, John, there was a piece that you wrote recently about this that involved a petticoat, and as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I think one of the things that's fascinating is the tremendous length you go to in using original research and just working tirelessly to thread things together. Do you want to tell us kind of the backstory there, what you found out, and maybe some of the sources that you knitted together to be able to tell the story?
Okay. This is a legend which has been told since the 1870s about Paul Revere's departure from Boston. And because of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, that made Paul Revere suddenly very important, and all people were very interested in this family lore that before then had just been within the family. And one story which was first published in the 1870s, so more than a century after the event, was that when 2 men were about to row Paul Revere across the river from the north end of Boston to Charlestown to begin his ride, they realized that they needed cloth to cover their oars, or else they would be making such a noise that they would alert the British warship that was in the Charles River. So, according to the story, one of the men went to a house, knocked on the window, and had a slow conversation with a woman inside, and then a petticoat fluttered down from the window, and they used the petticoat to wrap the oars and get across the river. And again, this is a great story. It's got this little hint of sex in it, It brings a woman into the story. There's a domestic side. Everyone can understand it. And yet, because there weren't really names attached to the story, because it hadn't been told for a century, because it's just too good, this has usually been repeated by historians, but said, oh, this is just lore. This is folklore. This is part of the legend. This don't actually believe this. Be entertained by it. Well, recently I went and I looked at the person who is said to have told this story, a man named John Richardson Aiton, who was a city councilor in Boston in the middle of the 1800s. And he said that it actually happened at the house that he lived in. And we know what house that is based on his address at that time. And so I started to go back and look to see what connections I could find. And it turns out that there seems to be a path of evidence back to a family called Richardson. His middle name was Richardson. And his grandmother was a Richardson who married a man in the North End and lived in that house, it looks like. Furthermore, one of the two men who is credited with rowing Paul Revere across the river was also named Richardson, Thomas Richardson, although it may also have been his brother John Richardson. That's something still to work out. So one possibility here is that the man realized he needed cloth to muffle the oars. He went to this house where his sister lived, and she tossed out her petticoat, which is not as sexy, but it might actually be true.
That is fascinating. It amazes me to think of them rowing just under and just past these large ships, right?
Yes, there was the HMS Somerset was in the waters uh, in what was called the ferryway, because one of the main ways out of Boston at the time was the ferry from the North End to Charlestown. And right in the middle of that ferryway, to make sure people couldn't get across, was this fully armed British warship. So when Paul Revere and his two friends, Bentley and Richardson, rowed him across, they were taking a great risk. Now, there's been some very interesting research that I recall in Sky and Telescope magazine, which looked at where the moon was on that night and how the little boat, the little rowboat, could have stayed out of the lighted parts of the river and thus stayed in the shadows. So that's another form of research, of finding just little details which can make everything seem make sense.
That's fascinating. So this gets us to Revere getting across the river, but he was not the only one alerting folks. Do you want to talk to us about William Dawes, his role, where he started, and how he avoided being captured?
Yes. Well, let me first say that we all know the story of the signals from the Old North Church. Those signals were not for Paul Revere because he already knew what was going on. Those signals were for a rider in Charlestown who was supposed to see them and immediately take off heading to Lexington. And it looks like somebody did that and then disappeared entirely from the history books. We don't know who that is. He didn't get through. He's not in the records. Who knows? So
Let me just stop for just a second. So when the signal, one if by land, two if by sea, was a reference to the British troops, correct?
That was that was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's way of poeticizing, versifying the message. One if by land meant that the British the British Army is going to march out by that narrow neck onto the land part of Massachusetts. Two if by sea meant they were going to be crossing the Charles River, sort of like the Charlestown Ferry. And if they were going out by the neck, that means they were probably headed for someplace in the south central part of Massachusetts, maybe Worcester, where there were a lot of arms. And if they're going out by the water, they were heading out to somewhere in the northern part of Massachusetts, i.e. to Concord. And so that was why it was significant which way the British were going out, why Dr. Joseph Warren and Paul Revere wanted to send that signal as quickly as possible with the lanterns in the Old North Church. And the signal went out, and then boom, that chain of information just stopped. So in fact, the signals
There we go.
There we go. I'm back. Meanwhile, Dr. Joseph Warren also, Paul Revere was actually the plan C. Plan A was sending William Dawes, another patriot activist, a man who had in fact probably been involved in hiding these cannon, to send him out by the narrow road on the neck all the way out uh, to Lexington to Warren, Hancock, and Adams. And that was a much longer ride. And people say that Dawes also had a shorter horse, so that by the time he arrived in Lexington, Revere had been there for 30 minutes. But seeing both of them, again, Dawes was also, both Revere and Dawes were activists, so Hancock and Adams knew them, could trust them, and said, okay, this is serious. Adams immediately tried to argue Hancock into leaving town, which took hours. Revere and Dawes decided to go beyond their instructions from Dr. Warren and ride on to Concord, where these cannon and other armaments were, in order to warn them. Their mission was really to just go to Lexington, but they decided to go on to Concord. As they went on, they met another man, Dr. Samuel Prescott. He revealed that he was also on their side politically, so they all three of them began to ride and warn people along the road, and then boom, they ran into British officers who had been sent out by General Gage expressly to stop people like them from riding out with the news that British troops were on their way. Well, the officers had already stopped some men, young men coming from Lexington to Concord. Now they're stopping these three guys, two of them from Boston. The officers actually recognized Paul Revere, recognized how an important activist he was, so they knew something was up. As they stopped the three men, suddenly Revere, Prescott, and Dawes decided to try to make a break for it. And they went in three different directions. Prescott jumped over a wall and was able, because he was local, he got through by the back roads and the paths through the fields and forests. He got through to Concord. Revere was stopped. He couldn't go anywhere. Dawes went riding off in the other direction, turned his horse into a courtyard, his family later said, and as he rode up into the courtyard, he yelled out, "I've got two of them behind me, come on!" And so the British officers pulled back because they thought, oh, we're being led into an ambush here. And he fell off his horse, he lost his watch. This is all stories that were told by the Dawes family in the 1870s. So again, it's a great story. It feels like it should be legend. And yet, one thing I found was that back in May 1775, this story of Dawes calling out that there were people about to capture him as he ran into a courtyard, that was in the newspapers at the time. So Dawes was telling that story immediately after it happened, and which means it probably did happen that way.
Well, that's very interesting. You know, we had a couple of questions posted earlier, and we've asked those this evening. There were a couple of more recent ones, and I'm going to go ahead and mention those. John, you let us know whether or not those make sense to talk about now or talk about another time. One of the questions has to do with Lexington generally, and here's where our next speaker on April 30, Alexander Kane, may come in. Alexander Kane has researched and written extensively on the residents of Lexington, the residents of Concord, and what happened as a part of this. We all know the kind of military engagement and so forth, and he's written about what happened to folks who actually lived there and so on. So we'll talk about Lexington in a couple of weeks on April 30th, 8 p.m., same place. Someone asked about Israel Bissell. Is that weave in here somewhere?
Israel Bissell is another legend of this story, and in fact, in that case, Israel Bissell is said to have ridden from Watertown on the 19th of April with news that the British had come out. They had come out. He was supposed to have ridden all the way with this news south through Connecticut, through New York. Some people say he even went as far as Philadelphia. That's not true. And in fact, Israel Bissell was not his name. The man who did the writing, and he rode from Watertown to Hartford, Connecticut, was named Isaac Bissell. And in many places where he stopped to rest his horse, the local authorities took hold of the message he was carrying, and now you can see. Okay, took hold of the message he was carrying and copied it. And in that copying, Isaac Bissell's name was misspelled as Israel Bissell. There was an actual Israel Bissell who gets credit for this, a man from Connecticut, but there's also an Isaac Bissell, and Isaac Bissell's name appears on all the other documents, including him asking for his payment from Massachusetts for making this ride. So the name of Israel Bissell is all over the place, but really we should be crediting Isaac Bissell with carrying that news.
That's perfect.
And a bunch of other guys whose names we don't know.
Well, Kerry, thanks for joining us again. John, this has been so interesting. I want to just remind folks about your book, and Kerry, folks can purchase that through the historycamp.org/online site.
Right. If you go to historycamp.org/online, we have a link there. We also have a link to John's great blog, so you can go and check that out and get more great information about this period.
You know, let's also post, in the run up to the show, we found a couple of maps. We'll add links to those in that. And I think it's probably also worth talking just a couple minutes about History Camp for folks who may not be familiar with it. So despite camp in the name, it's actually for adults, and it brings together adults from all walks of life. This is the program that usually we hand out at History Camp. The reason we have them here now, of course, is because we had to postpone. Kerry, do you want to describe just a little more about History Camp? In fact, in History Camp Boston, we were sold out, right? How many people were we expecting?
We had about 550 people register, so we were sold out, and we had to postpone that. I guess good news for those of you who couldn't come in March, there will be some spots that will open up in July, and we will release those tickets when we get a little bit closer. So History Camp is just a great place when you're a history nerd. You can come together and have an instant community of other people who absolutely love history. We have several sessions running concurrently, so you get to choose throughout the day what you want to go and listen to. We don't have any theme, and so we get all sorts of history topics. So there really is something for everyone there, and it's a really good day for people who love history. So we have high hopes for July 11th for Boston, and we will be having Colorado on October 10th, Virginia on November 7th. We also had to postpone Philadelphia, and that we are aiming for the fall. We don't have a date yet, but you can go and look at historycamp.org, and all of these have pages where you can get the most up-to-date information.
Well, that's great. John, you're going to be speaking July 11th, and I think we've got more than 50 other presenters, as Kerry said, across all aspects of history. So as we wrap up, 2 weeks from now, Kerry, Alexander Kane on April
30th. At 8 p.m., and I think we know how to get there on time this time.
Thanks for folks letting us know they were interested. We started to get messages around 8:01, wondering where it was. You know, one of the other things that's come up, and this is just something that Kerry and I are starting to talk through, is one of our partners in History Camp. It has been asking about an idea around some trivia event, and so we're going to learn from them kind of what shape that might take, and that may be something we do at some point in the future. But definitely April 30th, Alexander Kane at 8 p.m. With respect to History Camp Boston, so Kerry, if somebody said, I want one of those spots. How do they find out when those might open up?
You want to sign up on the Boston email list. So go to historycamp.org/Boston, and there is a link to sign up for the email list there. We will notify our email list first.
That's great. John, thanks so much this evening. I know folks will enjoy seeing you at History Camp Boston. They'll enjoy reading your book, and they'll enjoy reading your blog. You've been doing that for how many years?
Since May 2006, so it's going to be 14 years next month.
And that's 7 days a week.
That's over 5,000 blog postings.
That is just amazing.
Insane. Yes, insane.
So if folks have comments about tonight's session, thoughts about topics they'd like to hear in the future, let us know. We've gone ahead and compiled a list of some of the folks who are other History Camp presenters, both from Boston and other history camps, who we're inviting for the following weeks. Thanks everyone for watching. Carrie, any closing comments?
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, John, for spending your evening with us. And if we did not get to your question tonight, we will try to get that over to John and see if we can post the answer on our website or get that over to you somehow. Thank you so much. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Great.